Hello and welcome to End Zone Focus. I'm Alan Lee. Now, last week on the programme, our guest was the Reverend Stephen Sizer, a British Anglican minister who's critical of what he calls Christian Zionism, which he says is perpetuating violence in the Middle East by its uncritical support of the State of Israel. Today we're exploring the same story but from a different perspective, that of Tim Sisarich, who of course we know best as the head of Focus on the Family in this country, but who's also experienced daily life in Israel when he lived and worked on a kibbutz, and in fact he's just returned from a visit there. So Tim, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Tell us a bit about what it was like to live and work on a kibbutz.
I think a kibbutz was nothing like I imagined. I thought I'd be picking grapes and lying in the sun. In fact, I was working in a plant nursery next to a chicken house that... Anyway, the life, we really loved it. We really loved it. But one thing that's interesting about a kibbutz is that it's socialist. And so socialist Israelis think differently to those that are in the cities. So they have a very different view of the Palestinians and the Palestinians' right to self-existence and self-governance. So while we didn't meet a huge amount of Palestinian people or mix with a lot of them, our views were shaped a lot by the people that we spent time with. And so hence I come back now with a heart that is very much pro-Israel and pro those people in the land, but also very much pro these poor Palestinians that are stuck in refugee camps. And sometimes I struggle to work out where to put that.
Which I think is probably the situation that a lot of Christians in the West find themselves in that we feel that these are God's chosen people, this is their land, that's where they should be. Is it as simple as that?
I wish I could say yes it was, but I don't think it is, for a number of reasons. One is, I believe, and again I'm not a theologian, but you know, having lived there, having read scripture, and I believe that Israel being in the land is a fulfillment of prophecy. I personally can't see how you can see past the prophecies that have pointed to Israel being back in the land. However, I would say the prophetic or biblical nature of Israel being in the land, that's up to God to look after. Israel being in the land today is a UN mandate, so that's civil law. So they have a civil right to be in the land where they are. So then you've got a whole people group who were displaced, the Palestinian people, who a lot of Christians like to say weren't Palestinians before they had the stamp of Palestinian put on them. They were just, again, Arabs or Bedouin or whatever, but they're a people group in and of themselves. And that, in 60 seconds, is a simplified version of actually how complicated it really is.
So let's go to the church's parts in all this. Christian Zionism, which is one of the things that Stephen Sizer was concerned about. What do you see as, what is Christian Zionism?
Well, interestingly enough, I agree with the comments that Stephen made about Christian Zionism. I think that it is a very narrow approach. I think that Christians need to recognise prophecy, but they also need to recognise that Zionism is a movement in and of itself. It's a movement, as he said, that was started back in the late 1800s, and it was all about saying the Jews deserve a homeland. When they realised that there was some traction to be made off the fact that it also, the Christian or the church agreed with that, then they said, okay, well, let's draw them in and bring them into the mix. As a Christian, and as someone who believes that Israel does deserve to be in the land, I don't have a problem with saying, yep, I agree with some of the things they're saying, but I wouldn't say I'm a Zionist. And I think Christians need to be careful about calling themselves Zionists because it's not rooted in Christianity. It's probably even more rooted in maybe even communism.
I think one of the issues, though, is that it does feel that you've got... if Christians don't support the Jews because they, like us, are the people of the book, if we don't support them, who's going to? Because they do seem to be beset with enemies.
And I agree with that 100%.
So how on earth do you make this work then?
Interestingly enough, I think that we can make it work by learning that, yes, they have a place and standing with them. My wife and I, when we went to Israel, when the Israelis asked us, what are you here for? We said, because we want to stand with you. We want you to understand that people on the other side of the world believe that you should have the right to raise your kids in peace. Now, I think that still stands as true. As Christians, we must stand with those people. They have a right to be there. But we need to be careful that we don't say the government and the decisions they make are God-given appointments or God-given decisions. That is a state government. They're not running that country as a Christian or a religious country. But on the other hand, we also have to recognise, and Stephen talked about this, that there is a people group here that have been displaced. 3 generations living in a refugee camp. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons why they're still like that, why they have a culture of hate towards Israel, why the wall that has been put between is good and bad, and all those. And we could argue all of those. But at the end of the day, we've got to stop and say, as Christians, we've got people here, mums and dads, trying to raise their kids, that just want to have an opportunity to help their kids be raised in peace. So as Christians, we can actually look at them both and say, can't we love them both? Can't we express love and grace to them both and say, yes, God has called these people, Israel, whether they like it or not, into this land, but they're there to be an example to those that are their neighbours. So when they're being inappropriate from a biblical point of view, we need to call them out. We need to call the Israeli government out and say, what you're doing is not right. Or if they are, for example, the wall, we need to say, yeah, the wall's not right, but at the same time, the Palestinians need to recognise that if they had stopped blowing themselves up in the lives of these people, they wouldn't need a wall.
All right, let's talk about the wall. I mean, the wall, when you were there the first time, the wall wasn't there. You've just come back and the wall is now there. Yeah. Were you conscious that it made a difference to the way life carried on?
Well, it's interesting, actually. 10 years after being there, we went back. So 10 years, and I noticed that actually from being in Israel proper, there is a much greater sense of peace and a much greater sense of community. Now, I went as a tourist. I was there for 2 weeks, but I did talk a lot to both Israelis and Palestinians. I made a purposed effort to go into some of the refugee camps to actually have a look for myself. And they're not a pretty sight. But I would have to say that wall has made a difference. It's made some horrible negative differences to the Palestinian people especially. But for those in Israel that are trying to raise their kids in peace, it's actually made a positive difference. And I can't look past that as someone who says they deserve a right.
That's the problem though, isn't it? Because you've got, on one side of the wall, you've got people who are bunging missiles across the border, which, whilst, yes, they're not high-tech, they still kill.
Yeah.
And so you can understand why you would want to build a wall there. But at the same time, when the Palestinians see themselves as the victims of ethnic cleansing, you know, they're being shifted out of what was their own country. Stephen Sisarich talks about it being the formation of an apartheid state. You can understand why they're a little bit miffed.
And I agree with that 100% as well. To stand on the side of Israel in this particular discussion, no one has stood up and made a comment about the miles upon miles upon miles of brick wall that has been built between Texas and Mexico. No one has said a word about that. No one has said a word about what's going on all over the world in terms of people being taken from their land and that land being conquered. Israel conquered those lands after being attacked in the 40s, in the 60s and in the 70s. So anywhere else in the world, people would say, okay, that's what happens in war and the land's been taken. The second point to make is the wall goes up to separate 2 states. The Palestinian state, while Israel are doing some things in there with the settlement programs and the ultra-Orthodox Jews, and I think that's a point worth discussing, are putting their caravans in places and forcing the army to protect them. This land over on this side of the wall, that's Palestinian territory. We'll let them live in that land, and the wall shouldn't make a difference in the sense that if that's their country and that's Israel's country, let them live like that. And if the Palestinians want to come across and do some work, well then that's an area of negotiation between the 2 governments.
You talked about the settlements, and that's a big bugbear, I know, because the Palestinians see it as, you know, they haven't got much land, and now they're building on that as well. Yeah. I know the Israeli government is saying, okay, we're not going to build that, but it seems to be, you know, they say we're not going to do it, but we're going to do it anyway. Yeah. I mean, what's the story there?
Well, I'm not a political expert or a political scientist. I can only tell you what I've sort of gleaned over the years. One of the biggest issues, I think, in Israel is you've got a fundamentally, overtly religious Orthodox party called the Shas Party, which holds the balance of power. And Israel's government is always seems to be on tender hooks of falling apart anyway. So in a sense, these guys, this party, they have to be placated. And because they're ultra-Orthodox, they push through a whole lot of legislation that they want regarding the settlements. And then you add to that the ultra-Orthodox in America, lots of money coming into the country. There's a whole lot of things at play here. It's not right, but that might give people some insight. So the government's trying to say, okay, to keep the whole country kind of going, and we're spending millions and billions on this war effort. We've got to kind of have some money somewhere. And it's coming into the country through these American donors. And okay, maybe we do have to let these settlements happen. And when they start, they're often just one or two caravans, one or two families. And the problem with that is that they start illegally. Then because they're Israeli citizens, the army has to protect them. So they build a fence around them, and then they get more family in and have more kids, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then all of a sudden they say, oh, it's a town now. Israel need to be pulled up on that. And they need to say, if you guys want the respect of the West and the respect of the church, stop it.
But the church is actually quite supportive, it seems.
Well, that I suppose depends on who you ask. Stephen would say that the church that he's connected with don't support it. Again, I would suggest that because the church that does support it usually say, well, it's God's promised land, and the Palestinians are in God's promised land. We don't have to do God's work for them. Israel doesn't have to do God's work for them. And they're not building the settlements because they're honouring God. They're building the settlements because someone else has got their arm up behind their back. So again, we need to say God's business is God's business. We can pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but we don't have to do it so that someone else has to suffer. Again, if God chooses for other people to suffer, that's up to God. I don't understand that, but we don't have to be party to that.
Let's take a break and then we'll come back to chat some more. And welcome back to End Zone Focus. Our guest on the programme is Tim Sisarich. Our subject is the role the church has to play in the future of Israel. We've talked a lot about the practicalities of what it's like to be there, but of course underlying all this is I guess the theology that many people quote. I mean, there's that famous verse that we keep coming back to, you know, I will curse those who curse you, I will bless those who bless you. And it does seem the thrust of the Bible is for us to support Israel. And I guess that's what's underpinning a lot of what the church believes about what they should do in Israel.
And the answer to that, I believe, is that we have to support Israel 100%. I think that we, again, can't get away from the fact that Israel has become a nation again. A language that was dead is now alive. Prophecy after prophecy after prophecy has been fulfilled. Allenby did what he did based, he claims, on prophecy. So I think that we can't get away from the fact that Israel is there based on prophecy. I think we need to be very careful that we don't fall into replacement theology because, again, I'm not a theological expert, but I do know this, that if you start taking away some of the original promises of God that God made to the father of Israel, and I know Stephen talks about this and said we're all kind of under Abraham's covering, but that was a specific promise made to Abraham, to his people, and it was a covenant that was made. He actually put Abraham to sleep, and the covenant was made with God. So it had nothing to do with Abraham honouring or dishonouring it. God said, this is a promise. And again, I know Stephen says that is fulfilled in Christ. Well, again, you've got to be careful when you start tampering with prophecy. And you look at, because once you start doing that, you have to ask questions about prophecies that follow that. So I think, again, I'm not an expert. Someone could pull me apart on this, but I'm going to put it out there. I think you've got to say, this prophecy was for that land. And I think that what happened in 1948, fulfillment of prophecy, in my opinion, no questions asked. However, as Christians, it doesn't mean that we have to accept what's going on over there carte blanche. I think God calls us to be wise. I think God calls us to have compassion on the poor. To, you know, just because Israel is small with a whole world of Arabs around them that seem to be pointing guns and sticks and stones or whatever it is, whoever you talk to decide the weapon they use. I think we need to say, well, is Israel making smart moves here? And I think the church needs to be talking to the leaders of that country with compassion, saying, how can we help you at the same time helping the Palestinians?
One of the interesting things that Stephen talked about was he felt that the church had ended up, the evangelical church had ended up siding with sort of right-wing politics in America, and therefore had what he calls an unhealthy influence on politics in the Middle East. Do you see that?
I do see it, and I think there's truth in that. At the same time, I don't think there's anything wrong with the church having sway on what's going on anywhere. I don't think we need to disengage from politics. I don't think we need to disengage with what's going on in the Middle East. As Christians, we're called to be in the world. So we need to engage in the world. However, I think it's when politics starts dictating to us what we should think and how we should act, that's then when we have the problem. And I would suggest actually that's what's happening in right-wing conservative fundamentalist Christian America.
So, I mean, you've been there recently. You've spoken to Palestinians, you've spoken to Jewish people. Do you see any points of contact? Because everyone I talk to, and as you know, I've been there too, the thing that seems to come across all the time is that there are no, these cogs aren't meshing. There are no points of contact. So how is anything ever going to get fixed?
Well, this is where I'm going to disagree with what Stephen said. I think it's when we as Christians get on the ground over there, and not necessarily just have to pack up our stuff and get on the ground, but actually go visit the land and see it for ourselves, or start praying for it and start reading and start researching. I think that's when we'll start to see change happen, because it's when the Palestinian people see that we care. It's when the Israeli people see that we care. In fact, the Bible says that the whole reason that the gospel was given to the church was so that we could cause the Jew to be jealous for what we have. So I think we need to be careful, instead of saying we've got to set them up as the Messiah's chosen. Actually, we need to say to them, hey, listen, this is how you're called to live. And so I think that the more we look and are open actually to both sides of the equation as Christians, and then say, how can we help? Then, and it's a very practical way of looking at this is when I lived there, I learned Hebrew, I really engaged in the culture, I brought a prayer shawl, I bought an Israeli flag, and I came back and I said, you know what, I just love the land, I love the people, I care about both sides. And then I went back this time, and the driver, I was talking to him in my broken Hebrew, and I could see he just was really disinterested in me trying. And finally I said to him, where are you from? And he says, East Jerusalem. And I said, oh, yeah, so you're Palestinian? And he said, yeah. And I said, how do I say hello? 2 days later, after we were chatting, he gave me a sheet that had a whole lot of phrases that I could conduct conversations with him. He was telling me about all his family's history, and he really, suddenly we were engaging. And I realised something quite profound. As much as when I was there the first time I said I cared about both sides, I actually didn't stop to really look. And as Christians, God says we must be Bereans. We must go and see for ourselves. Again, I'm not saying we have to go to the land and look, but you actually have to say, okay, I'm going to be willing to look at both sides here. Those guys have got their issues and their struggles. These also have their issues and their struggles. As a Christian, how can I bring unity and wholeness to that situation, even if it's only just in a small piece, to the one driver, the Palestinian driver that I spoke with, to the family that I'm connected with on my family's kibbutz? How can I do this as a Christian?
One of the things you've said to me in the past, and when we've been talking about this, is how from birth Palestinians are told that Israelis are the bad guys, and from birth the Israelis are told that the Palestinians are the bad guys. Yeah. Now, I grew up in a country where Northern Ireland had exactly the same thing, where Catholics were told Protestants were the bad guys and vice versa. How do you overcome a lifetime of indoctrination?
That's a great question, and one that if you were to just say, what's the answer? You'd go, well, there's no answer. One of the things we've done at Focus on the Family in New Zealand is we've said, if we're going to help change families in this country, so if I want kids to grow up in a home where they're really thriving, I'm not necessarily going to be that, but I can train my kids to raise their kids that way. So it may take 3 generations in this country for us to stamp out family violence, or to stamp out men abusing their wives, etc. Well, I think we need to look at the situation in the Middle East long term. That this is a long-term picture, that as a church, if we're really going to help bring about change in that land, again, we have to say, how can I help instead of saying, I'm only going to sit on this side or the other. And I've got to be honest with you, Alan, I know very few Christians, especially leaders and those of influence, who actually have a foot in both camps. Most of them say, I'm pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, or I'm pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian. But I think we've got to stop with that and say they're all God's children. God loves them all the same. Yes, Israel have a special place in his heart and a special place here, but they're all God's children. And so we need to say, how can I engage bringing two kids together that they can actually learn? And that's what's happening actually. There's some really cool initiatives happening in Israel at the moment where kids are coming together and playing and realising, oh, we both like playing football. Oh, we both like Arsenal. Oh, and we're kind of the same. And so actually what's happening is those walls are starting to come down. So while a physical wall may have to stay in place, because we're always going to have extremists, actually if we come together and say, how can we bring the people together over a meal, as it were, then I think we'll slowly start to see change happen. And I think if we say, I'm going to be in this for the long haul, as Christians, as a church, we will see change.
Is that the church's role?
I think it's one of the church's role, yeah. I think that we need to be sure that we're not being one-eyed or judgmental.
It's quite hard though, isn't it? I mean, you say that, but you know, when you've got missiles coming over the border, it's hard not to be judgmental.
Yeah.
Because your natural reaction is to say, you know, here are innocent people being killed by extremist terrorists who may be a minority, but even so, they are still there.
And that's why I really stand with Israel in terms of their need to defend. I stand with Israel in building the wall. I agree. I think those things are necessary. I have lived on a kibbutz where one of the people who was my age, she was stabbed to death by terrorists. And I've sat there as the kibbutz grieved and then said, well, maybe they wouldn't have done this if Israel hadn't built the territories or in the territories or something. And then you sit there and you go, wow. Actually, here's a group of people that are saying, actually, it's not as black and white as you might think. Surely we can show some compassion. There's an incredible book by a Gaza doctor who had his daughters killed by an Israeli tank. And he turns around and he's written a book that says, I shall not hate. And if we want to bring about peace, we have to come in and say, how can we work together? There is a sort of a caveat here that the Bible says we will not have peace until Jesus, the Prince of Peace, stands on the Mount of Olives. So, and I don't want to be defeatist and say it's never going to happen until Jesus comes back. But the Bible does clearly say, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And then how often have we heard sermons that say sometimes a prayer means being legs to the prayer. Instead of just saying, God, bring peace, maybe God's saying, I want you to do something about it. Actually, to tell you the truth, that's what started me on this journey. I thought, you know, I have a view of the Palestinian people and I think I'm fair, but really I've never read anything by... And then I started reading some of these British authors who are journalists and they're very vehement in their hate towards Israel, and I struggled to get through them, to be honest. But as I journeyed through, I started to get a clearer picture of why they're like they are. And then I thought, okay, well, then in that case, when I get the opportunity to speak to Israelis, I can talk to them about some of these things. And so, again, as we journey together as a church body around the world, we can actually start saying it's not because of them that they're doing this, but we can actually say, okay, how can we help them see this side? And how can we help them see this side? If you've got a husband and wife who are bickering and on the verge of divorce, well, sometimes it's just a moment just to say, she needs to hear your view, and he needs to hear your view, and you need to know you've been heard. I know it's simplistic, but if it works in that environment, surely we can do it on a larger scale as well, if we're being willing just to go one step at a time.
Well, I suspect we'll be talking about this for some time to come, Tim. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
And that's all we've got time for this week. If our topic has been a subject that you have an opinion on, then we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email us at endzone@shinetv.co.nz, and we'd hope to bring you some of the reactions on this programme next week. In the meantime, that is all from us, so thank you for watching. Join us again next time. Ka kite anō. See you next week.